Hello, everyone. Here we are once again. And here in Colorado, we just had a crazy thunderstorm blow in, so hopefully it won't be too loud. I love thunder. You might remember that there's a verse in our text on the sound of a thunderclap, on meditating on the sound of a thunderclap and letting the mind dissolve into the silence after that thunderclap fades away. So it seems quite auspicious, actually, that we have this thunderstorm right now. So let's continue with our text. And you guys let me know if the sound of the rain gets too loud, and then we'll have to continue another time then, I guess. Let me just close the window. That's probably a good idea. Okay, this video is starting informally for sure. Verse 28. Yatra yatra bhaved vancha bhojanadishu vastushu purayetam yatha shakti bhavet purno nirashrayaha. I'll just put it in your chat window. Whatever desires arise for sensual objects, objects of the senses, like food and so on, one should fulfill them to the best of one's ability. Then one will become fulfilled and free of the need for any external support. I'm actually going to adjust this translation. Okay, so now it's hailing quite loudly. I don't know if you guys can hear that. It's pretty crazy. We're talking about hail that's almost golf ball sized. Okay, here's the revised translation. We might have to continue. We might have to do this tomorrow. What do you guys think? Can you hear me over the hail? Okay. I guess we'll just continue, and we'll edit this video afterwards. Okay, so we're starting again. Yatra yatra bhaved vancha bhojanadishu vastushu purayetam yatha shakti bhavet purno nirashrayaha. Whatever desires arise for objects, sensual objects like food and so on, one should fulfill them to the best of one's ability, and then one will become fulfilled and supportless. Now, I regard this as a problematic verse in a certain way, and that's because, as you might imagine, this is a verse that could be seen as advocating for some kind of hedonism, and certainly this is a verse that people who practice neo-tantra or tantra as a kind of hedonistic philosophy could point to this verse and say, oh, look, there it is. It says, whatever you want, go for it. So, the thing is, we don't really know what kind of person Vīranātha was, our author. Like most authors in this tradition, we have almost no biographical information about him. We do have a little in his case because he was a royal minister in the court of the king, I believe it was Yashaskara, in the mid-9th century. So we do actually know something about him, but what we don't know is how he intended this verse to be interpreted. Who knows? Perhaps he did have a hedonistic side to him. And indeed, we actually find verses like this only very rarely in the tantric literature. We do have a parallel in the Vīranātha Tantra, verse 72. And I'll paste that in your chat window. For those watching on YouTube, I realize you don't have a chat window, but what you can do is you can go to the blog page and you can find these verses written out in the blog, The Blossoming of Awareness, the blog post. So that is, the link to that is posted in each YouTube video. So you're not missing anything if you follow that link, YouTube viewers. Okay, so then in the Vīranātha Tantra, verse 72, we do see a parallel passage. Again, the gendered pronoun should be fixed there. Whoever it is, let him or her meditate on the state of fullness arising from the opening up of the blissful relish of the pleasure produced by food and drink, and that person will become full of Mahānanda, great bliss. But I just want to stress, to be very clear, even though this is a parallel instance, we actually don't see verses like this all that often in the tantric corpus. So it is still true that that to view tantra as a hedonistic philosophy is, for the most part, a false view. And I think, the way I would like to interpret this is in much the same way that, in the same spirit that Mary Oliver expresses in her beautiful poem, which I'm sure most of you know because it's become very, very, very famous. It's all over the internet. The one that begins, you don't have to be good. You don't have to crawl on your knees through the desert, repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. So I would like to think, and who knows, but I would like to think that this is the sense, this is where it's coming from, this verse that Vīranātha gives us, that he's saying, hey, you're human. It's okay to desire things. And that certainly is, of course, a tantric idea that we shouldn't deny our humanity. We shouldn't deny our embodied nature. We shouldn't deny our sexual nature or our sensual nature. That is very much present in Tantra, even though, as I said, it's not primarily a hedonistic philosophy. So I think this is, probably or hopefully where he's coming from, where he's saying, hey, you can desire things and you can satisfy your desires. That in and of itself is not a whole path, right? And of course, this verse occurs in a context of all these other verses and all these other practices that he's also advocating for. So he says that if you satisfy your desires, yatha shakti, to the best of your ability, then you will experience the state of being filled sometimes, and maybe not every time, but and the word purna here doesn't mean physically full of food, like a packed stomach. It means the sense of repleteness, of satisfaction, of wholeness, and that fulfilling your desires is part of, or is a perfectly valid means to that wholeness, even though it's not an exclusive means, right? Or else he wouldn't be giving us all these other practices in the text. then we see, he says that you also become nirashraya, supportless. So this feeling of repleteness, purna, is also a feeling of, I don't need anything else. So, we had a discussion in the Tantric Yoga Now group somewhat time back where a person shared exactly this feeling from really meditating on the experience of eating a delicious chocolate, and that she found she didn't need to eat as much chocolate, and that actually she felt more fulfilled inside and more satiated by eating a smaller amount of chocolate, but going completely into the experience, being completely present with the experience. And that's indeed exactly what we're talking about here, that this purna, this state of feeling filled and full and fulfilled, is not, it's not in relationship to sort of the quantity of pleasure that you experience, but to the quality of pleasure that you experience, such as being fully present with a loved one, being fully present in that, eating that delicious food, such as chocolate lava cake, someone mentioned in the group, having that experience too. So I could say more about this, but I do want to get to these other verses as well. So in the following verses, in the following couple of verses, he talks about the experience of dissolving into this state of inner fullness and peace when there's a release of tension in everyday life. And he gives an interesting example, an ordinary, everyday example that we can all relate to. So this is verse 29, and I'll paste this in. And by the way, if I seem slightly distracted this week, it is because, whether you can hear it or not, there's an insane amount of hail coming down outside. Here's the verse. Vanchitam gaditam kinchit akasmad yadi vismritam punastasyanusandhanat kshanat kaivalyamapnuyat. If someone is told something that he or she was longing for, but somehow forgot, then due to being reunited with it again, he or she attains kaivalya for a moment. So this is interesting, right? It's this experience of when you're trying to remember something, that you like, whether it's somebody's name or just that experience, this interesting cognitive experience of you feel the piece of information is there in your brain, but you can't access it. And people say, oh, it's on the tip of my tongue, but it's the feeling is really, more accurately, that you can actually sense that the information is there in your brain. And nobody, cognitive science hasn't yet explained actually how this is even possible, because you don't know the information, but you know that it's in there somewhere. You can sense that. It hasn't been erased. I mean, sometimes we actually truly do forget things, and they're erased, And then when we are reminded of them again, we're like, oh my gosh, that was like gone from my brain. But that's not this. This is the case where you feel it's in there, and you're trying to get it, and perhaps trying too hard, right? Because often when you sort of let go a little bit, then there it is, right? So, this is what he says here is when you're reunited with it again, when there's, and this word anusandhana also means it can mean becoming one with, right? But here it's probably just you're reunited with that piece of information, and there's this release into this kaivalya, this state of just openness, and there was the striving and straining, and then, oh, well, maybe I won't get it. Oh, there it is. And that little moment in everyday life, he's saying, this is a taste of this state of spiritual liberation. It's a taste of the vibe, you could say, of the spiritual liberation. It's a little hint in the direction of that state of spiritual openness and freedom. So he would have us then actually repose and reside in that for a little bit. So if you have this experience, you're trying to remember the thing and then you get it, let yourself relax into, instead of just going on and thinking about the thing that you've just remembered, you can just relax into this state and notice, with this spanda, there's spanda is what this oscillation of consciousness. First it contracts, trying to get something, figure it out, know it, and then it releases and opens out. And to be fully present with that release and that state of sort of tranquility that comes. And he gives another example of the same thing in verse 30. Stanusyat purusho veti durad darshye vikalpite sunishchita mate kshipram nirodha samprajayate. One who sees something in the distance and ponders as to whether it is a pillar or a man or a person, when he or she clearly ascertains what it is, this cessation arises immediately. So, some years ago when I was in the sacred city of Vīranātha, on the banks of the Ganga, the north bank of the Ganga, in North India, also known as Kashi, very ancient sacred city. I was there in January, and you would get these mornings, this happens every winter, where you get these mornings where it's just so foggy, where the Ganga has just sort of, part of the water is turned into fog and is just blanketing the ghats, these steps that go down to the river, the sacred river. And there'll just be this fog everywhere. You can't see like even 20 feet. And so you can really have this experience of like, is that a person over there? Is that a pillar? What's going on there? But the point is, in this experience, he's just giving an example of the same kind of phenomenon where you're sort of straining to see or perceive or ascertain something. What is that? What is that there? And then you go, oh, it's a person or a pillar, whatever it is. But that's the moment he wants to bring our attention to, that this moment of, oh, that's what it is. And that in that moment, there's this nirodha, the mind spontaneously becomes still. So even if it's only for a second, right? It doesn't matter how long it is. He just wants you to pay attention to that moment and go more deeply into it. Our author wants us to do that, I mean. So notice, by the way, that nirodha, which is usually understood as a sort of absence, a state of something being absent. Like in the Yoga Sutra, nirodha is understood as the absence of the whirlings of the mind, the absence of cognitions or thoughts or emotions. But here, we can tell by the verb that he actually means something different. It's not so much absence, because he says nirodha samprajayate, arises. So this state of stillness or openness or expansive presence arises. This is what he must mean by nirodha. So I translate it here as cessation. I haven't updated this translation or this verse, but I'm going to change the translation to something like stillness, openness, expansive presence, or just keep it as nirodha and have a footnote or something like that, because here it's a positive, it's an actual state of being that can arise rather than just the absence of something, right? Because you wouldn't say absence arises. So hopefully that makes sense. So notice these moments in everyday life. He's only given 2 examples here, the trying to remember and then trying to ascertain what something is visually. But you could take many different examples. Maybe some of you could share in the chat window what your examples are of these moments where you're like, there's a contraction of awareness, not using that word in any derogatory sense. Contraction is part of what consciousness does. And a straining and a striving, and then a release and an opening out. However kind of ordinary in everyday life, however kind of seemingly insignificant, our author would like us to pay attention to these moments, go deeper into these moments, realize that they're a taste of the state of liberation. Okay. Any questions on that? Or you could post your shares about this, the experience in everyday life afterwards as well. So verse 31. Darshyai padarthair drashtaram pashyed buddhya yato darshaha tam darshtva mokshamapnoti yo na tadvat sabadhyate. Through the buddhi, which is the faculty of mind, which has the power of discernment. So buddhi traditionally is translated as intellect, meaning for the past couple hundred years, translators from Sanskrit into English have rendered buddhi as intellect, and maybe that made sense 100 years ago in terms of how the word intellect was used, but it doesn't really make sense now. So I argue we should not translate buddhi as intellect because it gives the wrong idea about what the Sanskrit authors are talking about, because it's very clear in the literature that buddhi, across the board, not just in tantric yoga, that buddhi means the faculty of discernment or the faculty of judgment. And this is actually super, super important, because prior to spiritual awakening, the buddhi, it is very judgmental. And even, of course, after spiritual awakening, but slowly becomes less and less judgmental in that negative sense and more discerning in the positive sense, more discriminating in the positive sense. So what's important to realize is that spiritual awakening is said to polish the mirror of the buddhi. Or subsequent to spiritual awakening, there's a polishing that takes place through our practice, just very naturally. The polishing of the mirror, what is that a metaphor for? That the buddhi is able to make more accurate and beneficial judgments, right? We could call them discernments, right? But so it can lead us, this faculty of judgment can lead us astray. It can make judgments that are actually either not correct or not beneficial, or both. And then as spiritual practice polishes the mirror of the buddhi, metaphorically, it reflects the truth more accurately. And then it is able to make judgments and discernments that are both more accurate and more beneficial to oneself and all beings. So this is a crucially important teaching in the tradition. We find it in non-tantric and tantric yoga, both. So let's just look at a parallel verse here for a second, and then we'll go back to our main verse. Beautiful, beautiful verse. So this is from Abhinavagupta. Sorry, the line breaks aren't quite right there, but this is from Abhinavagupta, his text called the Paramartha Sara. Oops, little spelling error there. But it's called the Paramartha Sara, which means the essence of ultimate reality. Pretty awesome title, and one with plenty of chutzpah on Abhinavagupta's part. He's not shy. He's like, yeah, you want to know the essence of ultimate reality? I'll tell you. Probably he didn't have that smart alecky voice that I just did, but anyway, he says, Paramartha Sara, verse 9, Adarshe malarahite, yadvad vadanam vibhati tadvadayam, Shiva Shakti Pata vimale, di tatve bhati bharupaha. As a face shines forth in a mirror free of dirt, so does this innermost being, this essence, this true self, this divine consciousness that you are, becomes manifest, being nothing but radiance and it becomes manifest in or through the Buddhi Tattva made pure by Shiva Shaktipata. So, maybe too many technical terms there, so I'll retranslate it, but just to say something about that first metaphor. So this is very interesting, because if you have a spot on your mirror, just the right sort of dirt perhaps, you might for a moment think it's on your face, right? You might think, oh, there's some dirt on my face. Oh no, it's actually on the mirror. Well, Abhinavagupta is saying, this is exactly a metaphor for how we misunderstand our true nature. You see, we think we're stained. We think we're stained by sin or impurity, and we never were. It's just the same mistake as seeing the spot in the mirror and thinking it's on your face, and it was never there. And of course, the realization doesn't happen in a second, because we're not talking about just believing that you are stainless and free of impurity. We're talking about the actual experience of that. So in the metaphor, it happens in a moment, and in spiritual life, it takes usually a bit longer to really experientially realize that there has never been any impurity in your essence nature. There's never been anything wrong with you. It just seems that way. Why? Because you're looking at yourself in the mirror of the mind, and the mind, can have issues, but you are not the mind. The mind reflects the light of the innermost self, your true nature, and it reflects that light better when it's been cleaned. And when it has been cleaned, then you realize, oh, there never was impurity. You see, it just appeared that way because that which is reflecting my true nature had, whatever you want to call them in the metaphor, had its dirt, right? So this is quite a profound contemplation, that you do spiritual practice not to become a better person, because you're already God, you're already divine. You do it in order to see more clearly that which you are. So we cleanse the mind of its impurities so that it can fully reflect the light of the innermost self, and then we realize, that was always my true nature. It wasn't. It's not something I had to create or attain or manufacture. It was always there. I just couldn't see as clearly because my mirror was dirty. Okay. Hopefully now I've repeated it enough times that you fully get it. I can be repetitive sometimes, but this is an important metaphor to really get. So then he says, Abhinavagupta says, so does this. He doesn't actually say self. He avoids the word self. He wants to avoid the kind of essentialism or the co-opting by the ego, that the word self can lead to. So he just says this. And, this word I am, which means this, is a very interesting word because we don't have this word in English, because you only use it for something that's immediately apparent and present. Like I could use I am for this pen, this, but you can't use the word I am for anything that's not present. So this self that you are, this true nature, this divinity that you are, is actually already here. It's just not fully experientially perceived. So he says, this becomes manifest, right, in your experience, being nothing but radiance. Bharupa, it's that which you are is similar to radiant light, right? We can't explain that which you are in words, but this is a pointer that which you are is not static, is not just hidden within itself. It radiates forth. That which you are, the divinity that you are, is like light beaming in all directions once you see it as it truly is. Even see is a metaphor, right? You can't see it because you are it, right? You can't see that which makes all seeing possible, but we use the word metaphorically. You can experience that you are it. So this becomes manifest, being nothing but radiance in the buddhi tattva, the principle of discernment, made pure by the spiritual awakening that is an expression of innate divinity. Shiva Shaktipata, I want to translate as the spiritual awakening, Shaktipat, that is of Shiva, that is an expression of our innate divinity. So now let's go back to the verse in our root text, our main text here, verse 31. He says, through this faculty of discernment, and we are supposed to understand, once it has been cleansed, as it were, metaphorically, of its impurities, through spiritual awakening and what follows spiritual awakening. Through the buddhi, one can see the perceiver of a perception by means of perceptible objects. Having seen it, one attains freedom, moksha. One who cannot do likewise remains bound, at least for the time being. So I realize we're already over time, but let's just break down this verse a little bit more, just to get clear on it. What does he mean? One can see the perceiver of a perception by means of perceptible objects. He's talking about a practice, and I'll share more about it next time because it's worth spending a little more time on this. He's talking about a practice where you start with perceptible objects, and by the way, we find this even in the Yoga Sutra of Patanjali, and then in a different form later in Tantric Yoga. So you start with a perceptible object, whatever it might be, anything perceptible, and that means sounds, colors, objects, anything. And then it could be the scent of a rose, it could be anything. And then you kind of retract awareness from the object of perception to the perceiver. And there's a specific sort of method for doing this that we can go over next time, where you start with the perceptible object, and then you notice the fact of perceiving itself. So maybe you're looking at a visual object, and then you just notice the fact of visual cognition itself and its nature. And then you notice that this visual cognition is simply an aspect of consciousness. It's not separate from consciousness, right? So the perceptible object, right, is an aspect of the visual field, and the visual field is an aspect of consciousness. So experientially realizing this, going from perceived to perception to perceiver, without thought per se, but just noticing. It's subtle and it's super, super powerful. And there's a way you can cultivate this as a practice. And I'll share that in the next week's video. So then he says, having seen, again metaphorically, having seen the perceiver, right? Because again, you can't see the source of all perception. You can't see the place from which all seeing is done. But you can experience it more fully. So metaphorically seen, having seen it, one attains moksha, total release from mind-created suffering, total release from believing that you are your self-images, you are what the mind says you are. That's moksha. And until you can perceive the perceiver, until you can fully experience that which you are, you remain in an apparent state of bondage. Here he just says one remains bound, but we know from other sources in the same lineage, in the same tradition, that actually this state of bondage is only apparent. It's not real. You're never actually bound, but you feel bound. You feel trapped in yourself, trapped in your life, trapped in your identity, limited and hemmed in. And that experience is real up until it's not. And it feels very real, even though later what you realize is, oh, I was never bound. I just believed myself bound, and so I experienced reality that way. So we're getting into some very deep teachings here. And we'll, again, start from the same verse next time so that we can go over that practice, because I promised to keep these videos short, and it basically failed today. But we'll wrap it up there. So, and there's some questions that instead of answering them in the video, I'll just answer them in the Facebook group. If you're watching this on YouTube and you have a Facebook account, please join us in Tantric Yoga Now. And even if you hate Facebook, hey, you could just hang out in the group. You don't have to go anywhere else. And I want to again thank all the patrons on Patreon who make it possible for me to offer free content to all of you on an ongoing basis. So thank you, patrons. Thank you to all of you. Nice to be with you. Thank you for your patience at the beginning of the video as well. Om.